Let's bring it back to studio now. I am joined by political analyst Dr. Thapelo Tselapedi, who's a political analyst. So, Doctor, in terms of what has been happening in the latest developments, we understand there's been a lot of delays around why voting closed so late. And obviously, the IEC coming out earlier on and saying that we should expect late numbers coming in due to those delays. Do you think they were well prepared for such an election of this kind? I mean, we've got 3 ballots. Like, the logistical as well as administrative nightmares must have been quite heavy.
Yeah, no, look, I think the bigger issue here is around the funding cut. And I think that talks to the issue around the training, the preparation around the 3 ballots, and just making sure that the machines are operating, making sure that there are alternative systems in case all of these things are not working. So I think it all really just relates back to that issue. Because, I mean, perhaps one could think about the long lines having been mitigated by additional voting stations and so forth. So I think the bigger issue is that, and what that also means is that we shouldn't put too much blame on the door of the IEC, unfortunately. I think we can put that perhaps at the National Treasury level as to why they didn't give adequate funding for the IEC. I think it would have been very difficult for the IEC or any other body publicly to have anticipated the level of voter turnout seemingly that's going to surpass 66%. And I think it would be unfair to sort of say that they should have anticipated that, given the historical trajectory of the less voter turnout in the past 2 to 3 elections, nationally at least.
Doctor, you mentioning funding as being a critical factor in terms of how the IEC actually prepared for these elections, but some were saying earlier on that the pronouncement of the actual election date didn't give the IEC adequate time for them to prepare for such a complex election. What is your say to that?
No, I agree with that. I think the announcement was pretty late. It did not give as well political parties to ensure that there is voter or sort of political education around what do these elections look like. Certainly.
But Dr. campaigns were already running by the time that the election date was actually proclaimed. The IEC did know that the elections are going to take place, albeit just not when.
Yes, no, I'm with you. I mean, if you're going to look at when did campaigns really start, we could start with the court case. Yes, court cases around independence, right? And the sort of positioning of either NGOs or social movements, which then morphed into political parties. Certainly, campaigning has been going on, but I think it was quite important that the proclamation give deadlines or milestones to the sort of work that the IEC must do. I think that's what announcement. At least the president, had he announced properly at a certain time, it would have given the IEC milestones. How do we design our sort of rollout of the elections? How do you make sure that political parties adhere to certain deadlines, making sure that their own systems feed into the IEC processes, particularly around the issue of submissions of names into parliament, submission of names at the legislatures. So I think that was the impact of the late announcement of the president.
I mean, voter turnout, back to one of your points, there is something that has been unexpected or unprecedented, particularly by the IEC. So let's talk about that. Shouldn't they have already systems in place? I mean, this is the 30th year of democracy, and it is not the first rodeo for them to conduct elections.
Yes, but certainly, but like I said earlier, just bear in mind that given the trajectory of voters, that number has been decreasing. And I would think part of your rationale for looking at the budgets is to look at the historical trajectory. Similarly, in the way that they do the projections.
In South African voters, maybe they've had a change of mind, Doctor.
No, I think it's a global phenomenon where you see quite a lot of countries losing out on voters coming onto the roll, or at least coming out to the voting stations. It's a global phenomenon. I think a lot of parties, whether you're looking at the US system between the Democrats and the Republicans, they know that generally they're under 40% in terms of those who actually do vote. So I think that given where we are as well as a country, getting 66% in 2019, it's still big. It's still a big phenomenon comparatively speaking. And this just demonstrates that there is quite a lot of potential for South Africa to reimagine themselves differently. That we are going to have potentially over 66% does speak to the element of that there's a popular, impulse in this country to look at electoral politics a lot more imaginatively than in other democracies.
Doctor, where do you stand on the issue of voter education and how a lot of the reports that we've been getting today are voters that were not at the right voting station, voters that were not aware that they were supposed to register or change or even verify the information that they had? So who is it incumbent upon to actually mete out this voter education? Is it the political parties or is it the IEC itself? And do you feel that it was actually enough for these particular elections?
Look, I think it's certainly all stakeholders. You will remember that, of course, the IEC has a responsibility, one, to train its staff, the ones that are going to man in the VDs, but also NGOs have a responsibility to roll out. You'd find that some of these NGOs are funded, whether by sort of independent private funders or government institutions, to help roll out a political education campaign. Certainly as well with political parties. I mean, at the end of the day, these are your constituencies, you represent their interests. You should be able to inform them that if you're not going to vote at this station, go vote here, where are you going to be, and therefore notify. So I think it goes both ways. It's a sort of bilateral conversation between, the voter and the IEC, or the vote and the political party. It's a two-way, and I think there's a responsibility again on the part of the voter to ensure that they know that if they're not going to be in Gauteng, they're going to be in the Eastern Cape or going to be in the Western Cape, they must take measures in place to ensure that IEC is aware of that. At the end of the day, the regulation around 24A is really just about notifying the IEC. There is no other sort of additional steps or cumbersome or onerous steps on the part of the voter. It's really just a notification so that the IEC is also able to manage. I think part of the difficulty, of course, is that by taking out the sort of flexibility in that political system may have provided problems, because it was a lot more easier if you were not able to vote at this station, but as long as you're within the province, you're able to vote at another station. But I think it does, unfortunately, that sort of loophole of flexibility does open up the possibility of it being abused. Next thing you find people being bussed from one place to another to sort of dilute that area's strength for that particular political party. So there are all of those things, and I think I understand the impulse from the IEC to manage that.
Let's talk about this. I'm glad that you mentioned, Dr., voter responsibility and what it is that the voter themselves need to take up and actually check those balances. So voters in rural areas as well as far-flung areas. I've actually been monitoring some of the discussions throughout the day when voting actually started. And there was a lot of questions around, are we leaving those people in the rural as well as far-flung areas who might not necessarily have the type of sophisticated technology or access to information that the normal South African actually would have, like registering online and actually going to verify some of those details online?
So certainly a large part would be leaving them. Certainly, I think if we are going to look at the use of AI as a communication tool, as an interactive tool between the various stakeholders and citizens, certainly. But that also means that especially in provinces like the Eastern Cape, where it's sort of the communities and the people are very far flung from one another. It's very difficult, of course, to move around, especially for cars and just ordinary people. You'd have to do a lot more work.
And interestingly enough, those are the people that go out to vote, Doctor.
Yes. No, certainly. But I think it's incumbent on political parties, the IEC, NGOs, community-based organizations, to get into those communities and sort of do the manual work as opposed to the sort of meta or social media work that we often see, and that is easily digestible by young people. So I'm not sure how to sort of bridge that divide. But I think it means that more onerous or responsibility does lie with those like political parties and state institutions.
And that's very interesting, Doctor, because we did see those political parties actually making inroads. It was as if it was a public mandate or a political mandate to actually visit those rural areas and actually go and campaign. And that is where some of their biggest support bases actually at. So are political parties maybe not paying enough attention to the voters or would-be voters, eligible voters, would-be supporters when it comes to actually including them in terms of voter education?
Well, I mean, It's an interesting question. I think there's a couple of variables that you have to look at. The migration patterns from rural to urban.
Yes.
How is that looking like? And remember, in urban spaces also there's concentration of people, right? Concentration of people, sort of infrastructure, and how do you organize those sort of people politically? And I think in rural areas it's more, there's a lot of people, yes, but I think because of how they're far flung from one another, it's a bit difficult to organize them. I would think any sort of political party looking into South Africa in the next 20 to 30 years, you'd want to focus your attention on urban spaces. And when I say this, I'm not necessarily talking about Johannesburg. I may be talking about, e.g., Seshego, eventually becoming an urban space, so to speak, or Mthatha and all of that. So those sort of variables need to be looked at. But of course, also when you're talking about the urban space, you're talking about the highly mobile citizen as well. Whether they're in this country, they're in New York, whether they're in Paris, or whether they're in other parts of the country and they're moving around. So obviously that mobility, you want to be able to capture that, I would like to think.
So in your general assessment and overview of how the elections commenced, starting from those special votes, in fact not even the special votes, Doctor, those expert votes coming into yesterday where the whole nation went to vote, what should have been done better? What could have been done better?
Look, I think the reports that we got was around the issue of the opening of some of the stations. Some of them opened quite late or just an hour later. The lack of presence of the police. I know maybe in today's incident there was an issue of, well, it's getting late. We're in a fairly dangerous community and the police have left. What's happening? It's getting dark. So those sort of instances, I think they should have really just tightened them, and you sort of see a repeat of those situations. But I thought in the morning perhaps they were able to get a handle of things. But as is the nature of democracies, things will hit you from different places. If it's not here, it's here. If it's not here, it's another place. But I think how the IEC has managed to give us regular updates has, I think, ensured that we don't see these issues that keep on springing up as sort of systemic issues. They don't represent the totality of the picture of really the integrity of the system of the IEC. And I think that's been good to hear, because some of the times you go into social media and you hear about this and you see this video and there's a caption there with its own context, then the briefing comes and they give a fuller context. So I think it's been important in terms of ensuring or securing to citizens that actually it's fine, the system is still going on and the vote will tally up from 1 a.m.
All right, so Doctor, at this moment we are currently on 67 of 23,293 of those voting districts have been completed so far. The IEC did indicate, as I mentioned earlier, that the counting might be later than usual due to voter turnout, 3 ballots and independent candidates as well. So let's look at the upcoming numbers. Political parties will be flocking here, having their eyes squarely fixed on that leadership board. So a lot of action we can expect from here. So let's talk about some of the lessons that perhaps the IEC needs to take from this election going forward.
Look, I think it's not necessarily an IEC issue, but I think Parliament and other bodies that sort of support the work of the IEC.
You like the stakeholders, Doctor.
I do, because I think it's become so pronounced in this election that ordinary citizens are organizing themselves either as election observers or ensuring that there's political education. There's been a strengthening of civil society organizations, and I think that's important to sort of centralize in this conversation. But also to see that IEC is not working alone. It needs the work of intelligence gathering through the police. It needs the work of the defense force. It needs all of these ability then of prosecutors to be able to translate some of these problems into prosecutorial issues, right? So I think it's important to sort of have a bird's eye view of the entire value chain of the elections. That's really what I'm sort of focusing on.
So you don't feel this, all the delays or some of the, some of the reports about protests, entire communities even being barred from actually participating in these polls is going to dent the credibility of the IEC?
I mean, the context, I don't know if it's the same one that we're talking about. I know it was an Eastern Cape community.
Yeah.
They had been previously protesting, but it was them saying they're not going to, they're not going to vote up until their issues are resolved. So that's not necessarily an IEC thing. And the I think CEO came and said, well, we're still offering the service for people to vote. Whether they come or not is up to them. And I think, again, it's those instances where we can clamp down on things that on other sort of social media spaces may look like X, but actually when the briefing comes, it's actually Y. So I think those things have been good, because it does give some leverage in terms of the positive image that the IEC is doing.
Let's look at now the political parties. Do you feel that some of their campaigns actually hit the mark in terms of making sure that we see some of them at the top of this leaderboard that we're currently sitting in front of, Doctor?
I don't know who came up with this nice slogan that 2024 is our 1994.
It's our 94, right? Yes.
I thought it was Rise Mzansi, I can't quite remember. And I think it's resonated with the long lines, with the biggest category of voters being young people, at least between 18 and 38, 39. And I think that message has resonated, that it's I think, given them a chance to look at the past 30 years and say, well, actually, this is how the country has been going on. This is part of some of the issues. These are part of the successes as well. But how do we imagine South Africa post these 30 years, post the first 3 decades? And I think some of the messaging came out from Rise Mzansi. They went into trades, went into communities. Some of the messaging from the EFF has been great. Some have not been great because they've been threatening the selection, right? So it's been very interesting. It's been a mix. And it would be great to see what then the final result is.
Absolutely. And of course, with the emergence of the new political players in the political space, it's going to be quite interesting. Doctor, you and I are sitting right where the things are happening, right at the heart of those developments. I'm talking about the National Results Operations Center.